Meet me at the Musial with Alan and Daniel. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. Everyone come gather round, listen to your favorite sound. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We'll talk the games and all the rest, about the team that we love best. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We're gonna talk about the Cardinals all night long.
Good evening. Welcome into another edition of Meet Me at Musial. I'm your host, Daniel Shoptaw at C70. Joining me this week, Jeff Jones. You know him at JM Jones on the Twitters. You've got him on the Belleville News Democrat, and he's covering the Cardinals all the time. Jeff, how are you tonight?
Mostly dry, mostly not that cold. Listening to the wind kind of howl around here from down in my basement. Just moved in November and have the whole little basement office set up for the first time, and so this is the first chance I've gotten to enjoy the acoustics of the windows as the wind really whips through here. So it's a show almost going on here this evening.
Yeah, if you get distracted, I will understand.
Yeah, it's fair.
If you start thinking maybe there's a wolf at the door.
Well, the concern might be I have my I keep very few of the giveaways, so the giveaways they give at the ballpark, they run through the press box as well. Almost all of mine end up in my mother's possession. I did keep my Adam Wainwright souvenir mini guitar, however, so if that starts playing itself, then we'll know that something's really up here.
It's gotten strong. That's
Yeah.
true. So, well, let's talk a little bit about last year. I know most of us don't want to because it was miserable, but I talked to Brendan Schaefer last week, and I know I've got a couple other media types as well, and I just kind of want to get what it was like to have to cover something that was so out of the ordinary. I mean, you've been doing this for quite some time, but there's never been a season like this one for you to cover.
Yeah, it was fairly unusual. Even in the broader context of bad baseball seasons, for us to be to be pretty clear by round about the first week of May that they were just toast. They were 6 weeks into the season, and the season for all intents and purposes was over. There was not really, I think, any reasonable doubt to that, even that early in the season, and so it kind of became this weird, long, inexorable march of, okay, well, they're clearly going to sell at the deadline, and they did. They did all the obvious seller type stuff. We'll see what the return looks like. Early returns on the return seem pretty good, so that's fine. And then it just sort of became the grind of day in, day out of sort of having to balance, who's going to be around today, who's going to want to talk about this today. How many times can you ask the same guys the same questions? I understand that fans want accountability for that bad of a season. Certainly, that's part of what folks with my job need to do. But there are only so many times that you can go to Paul Goldschmidt and say, "Boy, this is no fun for you guys, huh?" Because of course it's not. And then there's not a lot that kind of gets illuminated out of those conversations. And so, when you kind of chopped it up into, well, okay, there's a novelty of how bad they were for a while, and then they went to London, and then it was the trade deadline, and then it was just sort of playing out the string in those little segments. It was a little more digestible, but yeah, kind of, I don't know, from an overarching perspective, it really is sort of shocking how unusual most of last season was.
Were there any play? And again, I know all the players were miserable. I have no doubt about that. But was there anybody that seemed to take it harder, maybe almost too hard over this whole thing, or was there an ability to try to keep some sort of even keel for most players?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy answer here is Nolan Arenado, right? I think that I think the assumption that most people have about Nolan's frustrations about last season are correct. I'm not entirely sure that those are all directed the right way, i.e., I'm not sure that Nolan spent most of last summer plotting for ways to get out the door, but he definitely wore it, and you could definitely tell, and you could sort of see in the frustration as the season wound down and they decided to shut him down with a couple weeks left in the year. You could see that at that point it was sort of for everyone's interest to maybe just kind of back him down, ease him off, and let him sail off into the offseason. Because, yeah, I mean, this is a guy who obviously, sort of engineered a deal to get himself to St. Louis. Had his first year, the team was relatively successful. Second year, that's a team that has a weird thing happen down the stretch and ends up with kind of a more heartbreaking loss in the postseason. And then all of a sudden, they're terrible in his third year in St. Louis. And so I think that he was definitely wearing that and feeling that and dealing with a lot of those things and kind of processing, the reality of, is this real or is this, a blip, I guess, as we're calling it now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, he was a person that had dealt with that, right, in Colorado a
Sure.
lot. And so, yeah, he probably thought he had left all that behind him. And maybe a little bit of an idea of, is this my fault? What am I doing wrong here? But yeah, I'm sure that he had an idea that he was not going to ever have to do that again. So to run through that had to be miserable for a guy like that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the idea when you sort of force your way out of Colorado if you're Nolan, right? Is that you're getting
Mhm.
into a situation where that shouldn't ever happen. And look, hadn't happened for 30 years in St. Louis. It had never been, more than had never been that bad. And so,
Right.
the fact that it was so bad so quickly, I don't know. I have been sort of wondering about this, kind of pondering it over the last couple of weeks as spring training is getting closer and closer. If in some ways it was easier or at least somehow less shocking to the system or less grating for that team to lose 91 games than if they had lost, say, 84 or 85 games,
Mhm.
right? That sudden just like plunge into the abyss is so shocking and so strange that maybe it makes it easier for them to write it off as an aberration than if it had just been a more gradual backslide into mediocrity that maybe would be harder to kind of describe as having come out of nowhere.
Yeah. And then I think, and then we'll shift gears a little bit here. As fans, we saw that 91 wins, and you're right, it was so stark that it made it harder for the front office to kind of whitewash, right? I mean, if they lose 82, 83, they can say we had injuries and this and that, and things will
Sure.
be fine. So I think that a lot of us expected, you know, very dramatic offseason. And I'm not saying that it was a boring one by any chance, but it doesn't feel like, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like maybe the Cardinals front office took it as much of a wake up call as they say they did.
Well, I think there are a couple things to consider there. I think number one, um, frankly, the market for Yamamoto blew up in a way that I don't know that
Mhm.
anybody was anticipating. That the Cardinals certainly, I don't think were anticipating. I
Mhm.
think a year ago, if you had told the Cardinals that Yamamoto was going to get 300 million, you're crazy. There's no way. But that was what the market dictated, and he found himself in a position where that was possible. And I think a guy who they were very interested in and very dialed in on for a long time was very quickly beyond a place where they felt comfortable. And I think the
Mhm.
other thing too is, the more and more that we've heard Bill do it, the third talk. I know he's talking to John and Derek both in the last week, and we'll talk to Bill on Monday. Uh, it's very clear that for better or worse, ownership views whatever uncertainty there is around the RSN situation as a limiter on their ability to spend. And so, it became a situation where however much maybe the front office would have liked to have had access to, or however much the Cardinals in their wildest dream might have imagined sort of pouring in resource wise for free agency
Mhm.
improvements, that maybe wasn't there in the way that they thought it was, and the trade market maybe hasn't developed in the way that they thought it might. And so, this was really a large part of the reason why you saw them move as quickly as they did on the pitchers that they did, was that they could not afford to get shut out. They had to come away with guys, and so they had to move quickly to guarantee that they got some guys, even if not the guys that maybe a lot of fans were hoping or even anticipating would be around.
And that makes sense. And I get that for sure. I mean, we'll say that it feels like, and maybe you would know better than I, but just, maybe it's cherry picking on my side of things. But it feels like, they're talking in November and December about a payroll, well, and probably more October, November, about a payroll level of being back where they were going to be before the trade deadline. Everybody's kind of thinking that 190, 200 range, even, and then to suddenly now be like, the RSNs is a big deal. I don't know what has changed in the last couple of
Sure.
months especially because they should be, unless something has changed, pretty much guaranteed that they're going to get their money for 2024.
Yeah, I think they pretty well are. I think to the extent that the lawyers representing Diamond have been able to say much, the indication seems to be that the Cardinals are going to collect, if not their full payment, then very close to it. Frankly, in reading between the lines, it sort of sounds like Bally is going to pay the rights fees long enough to keep as many Cardinals games as they can, and then probably default in September when it comes time for Blues season, because the Blues are a loss leader and they're gonna bail out, right? That probably is roughly what's going to happen. So maybe the Cardinals miss a little bit, though. If I recall correctly, I think that their rights payments are due pretty early in the season. Like I don't think that they're still getting checks from the RSN come September. So yeah, I mean that's entirely fair. You're right that nothing really materially has changed. Now, are things changing in places we can't see them in terms of them preparing to launch their own product and reclaim their own streaming rights and what have you? I'm sure that there are things happening to that end. I can't imagine that they're very capital intensive, and certainly not in a way that would affect payroll. In terms of payroll, though, again, like when we talk about that number, the thing that we have to be very careful about is sort of discussing the way the way in which you measure it, because you talk about payroll getting up to a level in the low twos. They're there, arguably, depending on how you slice it. I know that obviously, if you slice it in the way that is maximally flattering to them, they're going to get the bigger number. But when you kind of look at the count that Fangraphs keeps for the 40-man roster, that also includes their deferments, that includes their buyouts, payments coming in from other teams, and also crucially their contributions to like the fund for the pre-art players as well as player benefits. Those last two are a significant chunk, somewhere in the realm of like 17 to 18 million bucks. And so the Cardinals right now today, as we look at them, in the context of their 40-man payroll and that being the number which impacts whether you pay the CBT, the Cardinals are in the low twos, just like a hair under 210 with their 40-man payroll and their CBT number, as it were, right? So they kind of are there, and I have no doubt that will be the explanation that we'll hear from John Mozeliak probably tomorrow when he gets asked about payroll. Will be that. And I do think there is an extent to which that is fair. To me, the question is, why not just spend more? Why not just blow past the CBT number, right? Like we know they're not going to. I asked Mo that directly at the winter meetings, and he said that they would not go past the first CBT threshold. There does not, to me, seem to be a compelling reason why not to do that, other than it's a lot more money, to which who cares, right? It's not my money. What do I care? And if you're a fan, it's not yours either. But that's the way that they have done business for a long time. And we'll see how willing / eager they are to kind of update what that model looks like for a team that was extremely bad last season.
Do you think, and as you were talking about that, I agree. I knew that they weren't going to get. I'm almost a little bit surprised they're as close as they are to the threshold. But do you think beyond the idea of not spending the extra money, there's obviously Bill DeWitt has Junior has a relationship with Rob Manfred, right? We know that he was part of that committee that put him on there.
Yeah.
Is there an optics thing of wanting to make sure you stay under that cap, because that's the idea of why they put the cap in there to start with? And he, as a quote industry leader, he's trying to lead the way to say, hey, we're not going to hit that level.
It's an interesting way to think about it. I'm not sure that there would be in that case, at least not for the first threshold, right? Like I can imagine, if something insane happened and Bill all of a sudden was paying the Cohen tax, maybe that would cause some folks to perk up and take notice. I think if the Cardinals were, I think like Atlanta last year was just barely a first threshold payer. The Angels, I think somewhat famously, were like not paying Max Stassi while he was at home with his premature son to dip below the CBT number, which is just really classy stuff all around.
Right.
Yeah, just great work, Artie. If it was that kind of stuff, that's something else. But I mean, I think you are right to highlight Bill's relationship with Manfred in the way that that does inform at least some of their decision making, because it does, and that it is a part of it when you kind of consider, the way that they will or won't do business in some cases.
And I think it's also fair to give them some credit. You don't want them just spending to spend. And you're right. They went out and they got their guys that they needed to. And I feel like to some degree, I don't want to say they painted themselves into a corner, but we saw this a couple of years ago. Once they get 5 guys in the rotation under contract, they're very, very hesitant to try to go out and get another starter because they don't really want to dislodge somebody. So once they had Lynn and Gibson and then of course Sonny Gray under contract, it kind of felt like that was it. There was nothing that was going to move those guys out.
Yeah, I think you're right about the guys that they signed. I will say that, had the right trade sort of materialized, or I guess if it still does, though that seems increasingly unlikely by the day, I think that you could have seen Steven Matz get moved to the bullpen with relatively, relatively low stress, or frankly, you could see Matz flipped in a deal like that. There was a decent amount of reporting on that early in the winter about his availability from the Cardinals' perspective, and that didn't surprise me at all. Frankly, if you're the White Sox and you're going to trade Dylan Cease, for instance, you're going to need somebody to start games, and so Steven Matz being part of like a return there, that would make all the sense in the world to me. But no, I mean, I think that you're right in terms of the way that they kind of view those roster spots. We had kind of a big meeting with Mo in the lobby of the clubhouse 2-3 weeks ahead of the trade deadline. This was the big presser where he said we're selling. This was the day when Ryan Tepera showed up for 3 days and then was promptly dismissed. That was all that same day.
The Rick Hubble salute.
Yeah. And that first day I went in and I introduced myself to Tepera in the clubhouse and said, we got to get you upstairs next to the picture of Kamish. And he goes, oh yeah, we could do that. And he was DFA'd 2 days later. So we never did that, as it turns out. But no, that day there was a conversation where someone asked him in retrospect, what could you have done to attract starters? And the unspoken guy there was Quintana, right? Quintana was the guy who sort of fit them, who they knew, who they trusted, who didn't maybe have an obvious spot heading into the 23 season. And Mo kind of glibly goes, well, I guess I could have lied. But it's like, yeah, you could have. That's correct. That was an option that was available for you, right? Like, the idea that there is suddenly so much piety in the way that they do business that perhaps being less than forthcoming, obviously there are consequences. If you lie to free agents, that gets around. That's bad for your relationship with agents, et cetera, et cetera. But there are ways, if not to lie, then to sell, right? There are things to do. And so the assumption that, well, every free agent can see that we have 5 starters. Well, yeah, but the way that these guys are wired, every free agent thinks that they're better than all 5 guys that you have. And frankly, in the case of Jose Quintana heading into last season's Cardinals, he probably was correct about that. So, I don't, maybe say Montgomery, I guess. But no, so I think that there were more options available, but there are some instances certainly in which the hubris with which they conduct themselves does not necessarily work to their benefit.
I think that's what was so surprising, at least to me, that they went and got Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson, almost immediately. And then you want to raise the floor and you want to, have that reliability. I understand that, but it's also, you've painted yourself, right? I mean, you could have signed one of those guys, left a spot open, and, it's very possible, maybe one of those guys survives for a while, or, you go in and you have Zach Thompson as a possibility. While leaving yourself a little bit of flexibility. I was just very surprised that they went and kind of wiped that off the board so quickly.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised that it was both of those guys and not one, right? Their explanation has been that they thought if they waited that they might lose those guys. And maybe, I will say, admittedly, if for example, they had moved on Gibson and waited on Lynn, I'm not all that certain that Lance Lynn flies off the board.
Right.
A month before the winter meetings. But all I can say is I suppose they have a better read of the market than I do, and so I have to defer to them to some extent. That one doesn't necessarily pass the smell test to me. Frankly, it sort of feels like with both of them that they had an offer out to both, and they both said yes at the same time, and they didn't feel like they could say no once they'd already made the offer, is kind of what it feels like to me.
Yeah.
But, that maybe that isn't really reflective of the way that those things happen.
I don't know. I mean, that would seem to be just about as reasonable as anything else because, hitting both of those guys before Thanksgiving and then to say we didn't think they'd be there, next week where we have seen a very, very slow moving market this year makes me feel like if they believe that, maybe they didn't have quite the finger on the pulse of the market that they thought they did. But, again, they should have more information than some idiot sitting over here doing a podcast does. So I would hope that they really did have a better idea and they did need to get these guys. And there's no doubt that it has improved the team quite a bit to get them.
It has, and they definitely have raised that floor, which was definitely a necessity, and that's all a plus. But yeah, it does foreclose some roster possibilities, and it does sort of take some of the bigger options off the table. Now, are there free agent starters other than Yamamoto who maybe you would be willing to make the kind of commitment to that they had seen in free agency? I guess what I would say is, and this is probably always true for me because I am generally kind of skeptical from the team's perspective, at least, of the value of a lot of free agency. I get it. I get why they would, look around and be like, well, I don't know that we need to pay Michael Wacha that kind of money. That all makes sense to me. I totally get it. It doesn't necessarily inspire any more confidence or excitement in the guys that they got, but I do understand at least the perspective from which they got there.
Talking about the flexibility, and maybe that just kind of shifted into the bullpen because I think a lot of us have been. I think it's been a really good, interesting way that they have approached the bullpen this offseason. But I was very surprised that they went and got a Rule 5 guy after, doing that last year. And obviously Wilking Rodriguez didn't really play into this because of his injuries. But to go ahead and, take away a little bit of that flexibility by getting another Rule 5 guy, it must have been very, very high on Ryan Fernandez.
Yeah, I guess the thing to say about that for me is if it were me running a team, I would always take a Rule 5 guy. The key is not letting yourself fall in love with the Rule 5 guy and make bad choices based on wanting to keep him, right? I think taking the guy makes all the sense in the world. I mean, if you get to camp and he's your 11th best reliever, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Whatever it costs you $10,000 or whatever the hell it is to claim the guy in the Rule 5. And then you just send him back to Boston, or you work out a small trade, or however you want to do it. To me, that makes sense. I think Fernandez is a really interesting profile for that because he is not a guy who, at first blush, you look at and go, "Oh yeah, that's a guy who definitely is going to pitch in a major league bullpen next season," right? Like that's a guy you look at it and go, "Oh, that's a guy who was a little old for the level of Double-A and then went to Triple-A and did not pitch well." That to me is a guy who profiles as maybe somebody who was close to topping out at his level last season rather than a guy who is part of your big league bullpen. But I have no doubt that when we get to spring, we're going to hear a lot about pitch shape and pitch design and the things that Fernandez does that they like. And, look, you toss him on the pile with Riley O'Brien and Victor Santos and the other guys who are kind of on the bubble who they picked up this winter. And you hope that one of those guys works out. I think that in the aggregate, if among those guys and Nick Robertson, you find one aggregated reliever who can replace what you got from Drew Verhagen last season, then you're in fine shape. And I think there is at least a reasonable chance that
happens. Excuse me. We saw the two trades this year that did, cleared out outfield, two brought in a reliever. Did either one of those surprise you? It seemed to me, Tyler O'Neill's market was not anything significant. And it feels like they probably did pretty well about selling high on Richie Palacios.
Yeah, the funny thing to me is if at the start of the winter you had just reversed which outfielder was in which trade, I would have not even blamed. But yeah, sure, they swapped a roster redundancy for a gamble piece from Boston, and they get more certainty for O'Neill. Now, as it turned out, they got the gamble piece for O'Neill and they got the certainty for Palacios. But you got out of those two guys what you would think you would get out of them. as interesting and look, believe me, we talk about how terrible last season was. Richie Palacios from the middle of August through about the end of the season was every reporter's favorite player because if nothing else, Richie was in a good mood and willing to talk every day. And let me tell you, that was not always the case for everybody in that clubhouse, right? When you look at Richie, his numbers from 22 with Cleveland, where he did not look like a big league hitter, versus last year, he kind of just like ran in to 6 home runs last year. And, maybe you're a true believer and you think that Richie Palacios is a 30 home run guy over a full season. I think that probably is not super likely. And so, I think from an asset management perspective, now, if he goes to Tampa and he's a 900 OPS outfielder, they're going to feel pretty stupid again. But I think from, an asset management perspective, they got about as good as they could have hoped for out of Palacios. In terms of O'Neill, yeah, I mean, the value around the league was clearly just so low that Mo had to go out and say on the first day of the winter meetings to anyone who was listening, we are trying to trade Tyler O'Neill. Get your best offer in now, basically, right? And what he came up with was not a lot, I guess, depending on how much you like Nick Robertson and think that he is going to contribute. The only other thing I would add there, and I'm sure that we're going to get around to this, is again the commonalities between the guys they added to the 40-man this winter from outside the organization into that bullpen. Every one of those guys is a Chaim Bloom guy, and that is so unlikely as to be beyond the point of being a reasonable coincidence to me that it is definitely worth tracking. And to me, low key is far and away the most interesting thread of the offseason is what appears to me at least to be his very obvious influence having asserted itself into roster construction, let alone player development, so early, and arguably even before he actually worked there.
Yeah, it almost does feel like this was the interview process, right? Was, give us some names and let's go get them and see how they work. It does. I mean, you're right. This is the most uncardinal thing I think we've seen in the last little bit is to go outside and get a mind like Chaim Bloom to, even if they're not putting him in the direct chain of command as he's an advisor or whatever they're calling it now, still just having that extra somebody that has no relationship to the Cardinals at all to come in. I don't know that I ever really expected them to do that. They have been pretty insular for a long, long time.
Yeah, I don't know that I would have expected it to happen while everyone else was still here, right? After last season, I could have imagined if there had been a second negative season, I could imagine ownership kind of looking outside for some baseball ops changes. But the fact that Bloom was brought in, part time though it is, and somewhat informal though it is, but Mike Girsch kept his job and Randy Flores kept his job, like. That to me says a lot about the way I don't know. That to me will be a really interesting thing to monitor over the course of the season is whose influence appears to be sort of gaining strength and whose maybe is petering out a little bit with the way that these voices change. And frankly, look, there's going to be a lot of days where the most interesting thing at the ballpark this summer might be to take attendance, right? Is Chaim here? Is Yachty here? Who's around and who's not? And, what does it mean to be a part-time advisor? Because we hear that, Bloom is going to be able to stay with his family and he's going to be able to still live in Boston. And that's all fine and good. If all of a sudden he is at Busch Stadium for consecutive 10-game homestands, or if all of a sudden he is the executive traveling with the team on road trips, that's going to be a very different look and is going to give a very different context to whatever his contributions are going to be.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, to see how that develops over the year, and then, what does that mean for Flores and Girsch? It feels like Girsch just kind of is in some sort of limbo in general, right? I mean, because there's idea before Chaim Bloom gets hired that Randy Flores is kind of maybe the next guy to take John Mozeliak's spot, but Girsch stays around and still, I'm sure, has much value to the organization. We just don't hear much about him.
He does, and I don't. All kidding aside, or maybe not all kidding aside, he has arguably the best job in baseball, which is that he's got a really good title and he makes very good money. And his operational responsibilities do not maybe generate the kind of scrutiny that you would typically expect for a guy who has that job. Like,
Mhm.
I promise he does a lot every day. There is a lot that he does. In fact, most nights, on an average night, when we go down to the clubhouse and we're sort of, we go in, we talk at home, at least we go in, we talk to the manager, we basically follow him into the clubhouse. He goes into his office. More nights than not, it's Girsch in the office and not Mo. It's Mo sometimes, especially if there's like a roster move that needs to be made, or something, dramatic happened in the game. Mo will definitely be around. But more often it's Girsch and it's Jeremy Cohen and it's guys from that group kind of circling up with Ollie after post game to dig through some stuff, and it's Girsch on the phone in a lot of cases handling some parts of trade negotiations. I think somewhat famously Girsch was the guy who threw together the Jordan Montgomery for Harrison Bader deal at the deadline in 22. That was a deal that he was very involved in. And look, it's like anything else, right? Sometimes it's easier to deal with some folks than others. I don't think that anybody who has watched the Cardinals closely over the last 2 decades will be shocked to learn that maybe not everybody around baseball gets along with Mo all that well. Right? So you have a different voice, you put a different face on it, and Gersh does some of that as well. But you know, that's a really good job, and that's a really good position to be in if you're him for now. How much does that change, and what are his feelings about it if all of a sudden what looks like, if nothing else, what looks like would have been a title bump for him, if a guy like Bloom seems to be, usurping feels like the wrong word, but if a guy like Bloom seems to be jumping the line on him, that will be interesting to see how that works out, because there have been teams who have come to the Cardinals wanting to interview Girsch for their head baseball ops jobs, the Phillies and the Mets both, and he turned down the chance to interview with both and was plenty happy to stay in St. Louis. We'll see if that is still the case, if the structure changes radically here over the next year or so.
Yeah, I mean, the way you're talking, when you talk about it like that, it makes me flashback to what we had. It's different, obviously, but it's still that idea of the Jocketty versus Liddell kind of split, right? That Mo wound up having to kind of split the difference and try to bring the two sides together when he took over as GM. Obviously, these are coming at a different way. They're going to have a little bit more of a philosophical, agreements than those two sides do. But it's still, palace intrigue politics are always something interesting to watch.
And frankly, there's nobody better positioned to know how to navigate that stuff than Mo, right? I think that
Mm-hmm.
if you read Evan Drellick's book that came out last spring
Right.
about the Astros, there's a lot of good background in there about Lunau's years with the Cardinals and the way that all came out. And it's very clear from reading that two things were true. Number one, Bill believed in Jeff and thought that the stuff that Jeff was selling was the right stuff. And number two, nobody else in the office could stand him. So Mo was smart enough to position himself basically, with Jeff speaking into one ear and then him translating it for everyone else, kind of into the office, and then just sort of naturally funneled that power structure through himself and became that kind of go-between guy. And so it's not like he doesn't know how to work that game. The difference is going to be, what does it look like when he's the guy orchestrating it? And I guess we're going to find out.
What do you think? I mean, obviously it depends on how this season goes, and I can't remember exactly if it may be next year too, but what do you think Mo does at the end of his contract? Does he get that kind of big picture job in the organization that he thought he was getting with the Pobo promotion, or is it time to step away from baseball in general?
So when Mo signed his extension at the end of, or during the spring training last year, he talked about
Mhm.
wanting to have a succession plan in place and to sort of be stepped back from the day to day by the end of the deal, which is the end of next season, the end of 25. So I don't have any reason to believe that has changed. The one thing that I think is really, really connected here is the development of the complex in Florida. That's been delayed at least a year at this point. The Palm Beach County Commissioners, as I understand it, it's been a mess trying to get them to actually cut the check. There was some level of work that started and had to be stopped and maybe even reversed in some cases down at the complex in Florida to get it back into working order. When we left spring last year, the explanation we got was, well, take a look around because next year none of this is going to be here. It's going to be torn down to the lot. Spring training was going to be intense this year. That was how that was all going to be played for 1 year until the facility was built back up. That is not the case. The old buildings are still there, and it's going to look pretty much the same this year as it has in the last 5 years that I've been going down there. So we'll see how long that lasts. But the reason I mention it is because that's very much Mo's project. Like, he's got his fingerprints all over that one, and he's got a lot of thought about it, and spoke really amusingly wistfully last spring about how he was packing his office when he was down there last spring. Well, and guess what? Time to unpack it. But in my mind, hearing him talk about the complex refurbishment and talk about wanting to step back, it made all the sense in the world to me that maybe he would sort of, if not retire, he would maybe transition down to being like Florida-based full-time and sort of ingratiate himself into that part of the world. I could have seen that being a move he would make. Now I don't know, because if this team loses 90 games again this season, Lord only knows what that transitional period looks like. Or if it's a bounce back and they win 90 games this season, does he all of a sudden feel like he needs to stick around, A, to see it through, and B, to sort of, bask in some of that glow as it gets worked out? And I don't know. And the construction delays also are a thing. Like, does he need to be down there full time if they haven't even started the demo work yet, right? Like, there are a lot of things that change the way that looks. And frankly, I'm going to be very eager sort of throughout the season to watch that evolve and talk to him about how he's feeling about those projects and kind of his place in them as the year goes on.
We also know that Mo got a lot more help, at least according to the titles that were given out. Joe McEwing moves from the bench to a special advisor role. And then, of course, Yadier Molina comes back on staff after a year away. What do you think we're going to see out of both of those? I know McEwing is kind of overseeing coaches and stuff like that, but what kind of impact are either one of those guys going to have this year?
I don't think that Joe McEwing is going to have much. I think that last year, to get McEwing to come back and agree to be the bench coach, they had to sign him to a multi-year deal. It was a bad situation for McEwing to come into, just in terms of it being last minute, not having a relationship with Ollie really, and kind of trying to piece it together. He I think did a perfectly adequate job in that role, but I think it was clear as the season wore on that maybe it wasn't the level of whether it's trust or communication or just comfort, however you want to phrase it. Like, he wouldn't skip, right? That relationship with Ollie just didn't exist, and so. It was not at all a surprise to me that he got moved upstairs. I would say that his role in an advisor is going to be mostly, hey, take a look at a couple of these advanced scouting reports. What do you think? I don't think he's going to have a whole lot of input on the day to day. In terms of Yachty, that is a real big question, because unless the Cardinals reverse course here, they're going to let Ollie Marmol walk into the season as a lame duck manager, and they're going to let him walk in as a lame duck manager with Yadier Molina looming just enormous behind him, like with his shadow just cast over everything that happens at the end of the dugout. And I've had conversations with folks who cover the team about, like, how many games do they need to win of their first 20 to stop people from screaming for Yachty to take over? Like, is it 13 of their first 20 do they need to win before anybody calms down? I don't know. I know the schedule is not real conducive to that.
No.
And if it's at the end of April, they're 3 games under 500. Boy, I wouldn't want to be Ollie Marmol very much at that point, because that's going to be just an impossible spot for him to be in. And look, everyone's going to say all the right things. Ollie was super involved in getting Yachty to come back, and he wants him back. What's he going to say? What's he's going to say no? What on earth is he going to say there? Yachty is going to probably mostly not talk to us, but when he does, I'm sure he will say the right things about I'm just here to learn and I'm here to contribute and I'm here to help and blah, blah, blah. But he wants to manage. He's managing winter ball. He thinks he is ready to manage today, and he is going to be around one of the more vulnerable managers in baseball at the start of the season. And so, they can do as much as they want to do to kind of tamp that down and push it into the background, but that's not going to go away. I don't know the place in the standings at the time of the season at which we stop wondering about when Yadier Molina is going to take over, but it's not in the first month, I don't think.
Right. The Yachty situation is interesting, and I just wonder if the front office is able to not do that knee jerk of putting Yachty in that manager spot, because there's not a manager. Well, Tony La Russa walked off on his own, but pretty much there's not a manager that leaves on his own volition, and I don't know that the front office wants to get into a things are going bad and so we have to get rid of Yadier Molina type of situation, or if the fan base, as much as they clamor for Yachty now, wants to deal with him turning into Mike Matheny or something of that nature.
Sure.
So I mean, those variables are interesting, and I don't know how much they impact what the front office wants to do.
Well, what I'll say this: if this front office makes Yadier Molina the manager, they won't have to worry about being here when it's time to fire him, because they will have themselves been shuffled out in large quantity if that comes around. Yeah. Right? That would for the first time in a very long time for this team fall into the category of someone else's problem. Because if you make that move in the middle of the season, maybe desperate is too strong, but I don't know that it's much too strong.
Mm-hmm. Were you a little bit surprised that they didn't just go ahead and put Yachty then as the bench coach, or is this a situation where Yachty doesn't necessarily, as much as he wants to manage, is not necessarily really sure about 162 yet?
I think that Yachty is not sure about 162 if he's not the manager. I think that when you consider the sort of the salary that a major league coach makes. Well, here's and this was a really good learning a really good learning experience for me as well last summer, because I think I had some assumptions myself about coaching salaries. Dan Nicolaisen was on the big league staff last season, left the big league staff to go be an assistant softball coach at Ole Miss, and as I understand it, got a raise, like a substantial one, mm-hmm. Right? So this, the bench coach is obviously a couple notches up from that, and Yadier Molina is Yadier Molina. All that being said, whatever family issues there are that preclude him from being like the bullpen coach for 162 games, I bet those get solved in a big hurry if he gets to be the manager for 162 games. I got a pretty strong feeling that would be the case. So, short answer, no, it didn't surprise me that he didn't end up in that kind of full-time role, at least to start the season. The other part of that, frankly, is that, he has a lot more flexibility this way to kind of learn the stuff that he wants to learn. Like, are any of us going to be surprised if we look up in April and, hey, Yachty is managing Palm Beach for 3 games over a weekend? Right? I don't think any of us are. I think that would be something that I can totally see happening. And in fact, I wrote in my big predictions for the year column, I wrote that I predict that Yadier Molina will manage 1 game at least for the Cardinals this season. If setting aside everything else, like, sometimes the manager gets kicked out and gets suspended for a couple of games, or sometimes the guy's got the flu, or whatever. I think Ollie has missed 2 or 3 games in each of his first 2 seasons. My prediction is that on those days that it's Yadier Molina who gets the call, assuming that he's in a place where that's possible. Because, Daniel Descalso is the bench coach, but he has no managerial experience either. There's no one in that dugout who has big league managerial experience. And, the closest would be Stubby, who's got AAA managerial experience. Pop never managed Memphis. I think he stopped at Springfield, right? Maybe not. Maybe he was Memphis too. In any event, it's not like there is a very obvious person to take over outside of Yadier Molina for a game or 2, and that would not surprise me to see that happen in the least.
Might even get it at one of those split squad games in spring training too.
I think that is extremely likely.
Fast. Yeah, that'll get people stirred up for sure.
Oh yeah.
So today's news, as we get closer to the end of our show, today's news, the Cardinals settle with everybody that was going to arbitration except Tommy Edman. Let's set Tommy aside for just a second. But, some of those contracts that they settled for came in a little higher than projections. Was there anybody that surprised you at what level that they got their contract or they agreed to?
Helsley came in pretty high. I was surprised that the team settled as high as they did. I think the MLB trade rumors projection was like 3 or 3-1, and he ended up getting 3-8. That's a pretty big commitment by the team to Helsley. And in fact, it is substantial enough that it makes me wonder if that does not perhaps end up being in an area where they look for an extension. Maybe they buy this year. I think they did this with Gallegos, right? He signed an extension that bought basically his first 2 years of free agency, or his first year plus an option year. I think Helsley is probably a higher ceiling than that, and it's going to cost them more than Gallegos did when they did that deal. But it wouldn't shock me if they kind of looked in that direction. Otherwise, no. I mean, I think that like John King got like $5,000 more than his projection. I think Kittredge missed his by like 75,000. These were all like pretty close to the pin. Dylan Carlson, I guess, was $500,000 over. That good for Dylan, I guess. That argument would probably be fairly simple for them to lose in a hearing because he would be just about the only guy on the roster who actually has experience playing, a lot of experience at least playing center field in the big leagues. So pretty easy to make a case to a neutral arbitrator that he is essential to the team's success, whether or not he actually is.
Also, I mean, I don't know that it makes any impact, but Helsley obviously had a very negative experience with arbitration last year. And I don't know if the Cardinals kind of wanted to smooth some feathers, perhaps, making sure that they didn't have to worry about this year.
I think the settlement with Helsley and at the number that it was is probably suggestive of wanting to fix whatever last year broke. And also, I believe also that Helsley has changed agencies as well since that happened too. So.
And then, there's another year under his belt, a little bit healthier year. So there's a lot of things that go in there. Okay. So Tommy Edman then is what? It's less than 500,000 between him and the Cardinals. And yet they couldn't come to terms. And given the way the Cardinals are doing things as of late, looks like we'll be talking about a trial in a month or a little bit more.
Yeah.
It seems a little bit strange for the Cardinals not to come to some sort of agreement with a guy that honestly, it feels like they have almost sometimes overvalued over the course of his career.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that they let themselves to get here. The thing that I noted, and I just sort of countered myself just a minute ago talking about Helsley. This leadership team, this baseball ops group, has never extended a player with whom they went to a hearing beyond team control. Everybody who they've gone to a hearing with, Sawaka, Flaherty, Genesis Cabrera, Tyler O'Neill, Helsley last year, obviously is TBD, and then Tommy Edman, we assume this year. The other four guys who they went to hearings with were all gone at the end of their 6 years of team control, all of them. Mm-hmm. So we'll see what that looks like for Edman, and for Helsley as well. I guess it's the gap between them. I think is $495. So it's a decent chunk of money, but you're right. Like it's not enough that you would think they would be willing to sort of drag him through. I do think that if you're the Cardinals, maybe you can have some confidence that Tommy Edman is a guy who is not going to be maybe as impacted by the process as other guys were. Not that should probably be informing your strategy negotiation-wise, but I guess from a fan perspective, I wouldn't worry about Edman being so like torn up about the hearing that it impacts him on the field. But I do think it's notable, that they're willing to kind of go to the mat on this one. And I'll be interested to see what that looks like, when you kind of consider the way that these arbitration hearings work, and very often the arbitrators have little to no knowledge of baseball. the folks that are hearing these, right? And
Right.
you kind of hold up what Tommy Edman has done at the plate in the last couple of seasons, and it's not easy to, or not hard, I guess, to imagine him losing that hearing. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And again, to get to your point that the idea that they're not necessarily going to extend him beyond this year. I mean, there are a lot of middle infielders coming up,
There
and
are.
I guess it depends on how much they want to Dylan Carlson to play center field. But yeah, I feel like he's in a pretty tentative position. It's just a little bit surprising that they felt that way as well and feel like they've
He's
got some there.
Yeah, I mean, he's at a very interesting turning point in his career in that he is absolutely essential to the creation of their roster this season and could be absolutely redundant as quickly as next season. Right, because you
Yeah,
have to hold Edmund through the winter, because if Mason Wynn gets to spring and the bat is not there as much as you need it to be there, then Tommy Edmund has to be your shortstop. But conversely, a year from now, if Mason Wynn was in the top 3 in Rookie of the Year voting and Victor Scott is pounding down the door, then you probably don't need Edmund at all. And so
right.
that changes in a hurry.
Yeah, you're right. It's kind of an interesting time for Tommy. Okay, so winter warm up is this weekend. What's that like for you? Do you get much out of it, or is this just kind of more for the fans, and you'll get your stuff in spring training?
So I do get some things out of it. Crucially, this year, because of the way that the things kind of broke down with the signings, I have not gotten a chance to meet. I've met Sonny Gray briefly. I've met Lance Lynn a little more, but not a lot. But I
Mhm.
haven't got a chance to meet with either of them since they signed with the Cardinals, and so it's a chance at least to talk to them. That's important. I've never met Thomas DeJacy, so I'm looking forward to meeting him and learning a little more about him. This is one of the very rare occasions throughout the year. There are usually 2 or 3 where we get to ask questions of the DeWitts. That's usually pretty important. So that is a big centerpiece of the weekend for me. Otherwise, yeah, I mean it's mostly fan centered, and that's fine. That's exciting. There's going to be a panel, I believe, on Monday where I think it's me and Katie and John Denton and Derek will talk to fans about what it's like to cover the team day by day. And in fact, you might even get you'll get a really good up close and personal view of that, because we're going to all bail out halfway through to go talk to Lance Lynn, whose availability is scheduled on top of that panel. So you'll get a real experience of what that actually does look like. But no, it is valuable for me mentally in that it is a kickoff to the year and therefore the season, and kind of gets my brain in the right place. And also, look, sometimes things happen that are newsworthy. Sometimes Justin Williams shows up in the cast because he punched
Right.
his TV, and then and things have happened. So who knows? You never know who's going to show up in a cast to Winter Warmup.
Well, if it wasn't for last week, it might have been Tommy Edmond, right?
Exactly right. We got out ahead of that one. So
Yeah. So yeah, that's it's going to be interesting. I just wondered because I know that it's kind of a short availability. You don't really necessarily sometimes get that, the real in-depth conversations that you probably
no, I
can at
mean
different
you
times.
don't. But and the other thing too, because the Cardinals PR department was kind enough to sort of send over the schedule for the weekend this afternoon, so we could kind of plan it out. It feels a little thin
Hmm.
compared to years past. I'm not gonna lie. There's a stretch tomorrow, I believe that. So I'm looking at the schedule now. Our first availability of the day tomorrow is Mo, and he's at 10:30, and there's no one else until Sonny Gray at 12:30. So it's not like jam packed. The day tomorrow is Mo Zaylock, Sonny Gray, Tink Hintz, James Nail, Alec Burleson, JC, Drew Rom, Lucan Baker, Sim Roberts, and Buddy Kennedy. So not a lot of real hard digging to do
Right.
tomorrow. But look, it's a good time. People enjoy it. God knows that fans absolutely love it and have a ball with it. So I'm glad it exists. If for no other reason, it helps kind of get gets the muscles moving and gets the kind of the gears moving in the right direction again.
Yeah, that's all. What did I see? What? I know Nolan's not going to be there. Paul Goldschmidt's not going to be there.
He is not. He is not. And Miles Michaelis is
Michaelis
also not going to be there. Yeah.
So that's those are some pretty good chunks of people not to be there.
Prior engagements were told in that they discovered prior that it was going to be 80 degrees in Florida and not that here.
Not that here. That will do it quite well.
The prior engagement was that in prior years they came to this engagement and decided that they would not be with her. No, I'm sure they actually have stuff going on. This is not like the time that Albert said that his plane was broken or something, and actually he was at somebody's birthday party.
Well, and I know how many times Yachty seems to have had a trouble.
You're right. You can just never trust those commercial airline flights from Wildwood.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it's maybe Yachty needs to think about that if he's going to be manager. He may have to factor that.
And that, believe me, when I tell you the number of not joking jokes that we've already had, about the pregame and postgame avails with manager Yachty every day. Oh boy,
that would be interesting. And then what? Pitchers and catchers report on the 14th. You
on
get down
Valentine's
there
Day.
right about that time.
Yep, I think I'll get down there the Sunday before, which is the 11th or 12th, whatever that is. I think it's the Sunday. It might actually. Last year it was the day of the Super Bowl. This year it might be the day. I don't know. I don't usually watch the Super Bowl, so I couldn't tell you. But
Fair
it's
enough.
somewhere right around there.
Okay. And does it depend on how cold St. Louis is getting, and then maybe you get out of town a day or two earlier if it's getting -2?
My grand spring training tradition is to take 2 days to drive on the way down and then drive it all the way back on one day. So it's 8 to Atlanta, 8 from Atlanta to Jupiter. So that is a tough 2 days, but very doable. The one day on the way back, I'm usually very eager to get home, and so I leave Florida at 3 a.m. Eastern time like a moron and drive like a bat out of hell for 16 hours and get myself back in my bed.
So does that mean you're not going to Arizona this year?
I am not. So I will be in LA and San Diego for the first week of the season, but I'm going to be missing the stopover in Mesa. Will not be there for that.
Is there anything that you're looking forward to in spring? Either anybody to really get into talking to, or just to be able to see the dynamics of?
Yeah, I think for me, the most interesting guy to watch in spring is going to be Thomas Jaycee, right? Like I want to see where he establishes himself on the depth chart and what kind of presence he has in spring. If it's a situation where, is he a guy who is going to make an appearance? Is he going to get into the 4th or 5th inning of every spring training game and play a ton? Or is he a guy who we're going to see sparingly before he gets sent off to minor league camp when minor league camp opens, and we don't see a lot of him in terms of exposure? That, to me, will tell us a lot about what his path kind of looks like going into this season and whether or not they believe he's a guy who legitimately could play in the big leagues this year, or if that maybe is a year or so off. That is a guy who really jumps out to me. And also to see how the bullpen ends up being constructed, because there are a litany of arms. There are, there's going to be 12, 15 guys that come into camp. I was looking at when they published the list of non-roster invitees the other day. Most years there are guys on that list where you're going, yeah, that guy's not going to pitch in the big leagues this season. I don't need to carve out time to go watch this guy's bullpen. That's fine. But legitimately, every pitcher on that list is a pitcher who I will want to watch during spring. As I go down the list, how quickly can I find it? Oh, there it is. So the list of non-roster pitchers: Graceffo, Granillo, Hentz, Jerpy, Kyle Leahy, Loudis, McGreevy, Packy Naughton, Rajic, Tekoa Roby, Wilking Rodriguez, Victor Santos, Logan Sawyer, Connor Thomas. Now, there are guys in that list who I've seen in springs past, Leahy and Connor Thomas and guys who you have a pretty good idea of what that looks like. But those are all guys who you could conceivably see in the big leagues at some point. And the rest of those guys, those are some really interesting names who populate kind of the top of their prospect list. And so I'll be really interested to watch those guys pitch their way through spring.
Speaking of Packy, you're going to have to ask him why, after 2 years, he's changing uniform numbers from 70. I'm very offended by this. By the way,
I think it's funny that he dragged it out for 2 years, kept to 70, gets outrighted, and that's when he decides he's going to speak up and get back into the major league number. Maybe it's one of these things where he's kind of projecting, right? Where he's like, all right, if I pick a big league number for myself, then we're gonna, he feels like he can make it happen a little more that way.
Maybe so. But it hurt me because now I got to find out who's the next patron pitcher, because there's always a pitcher that has 70. Very, very rarely not. All right. Well, looking forward to it. Looking forward to seeing what you've got this weekend. And I just appreciate you joining me. It's been a fun time.
I'm always happy to do it. I'm sorry I messed up our annual appointment here, but unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, I fortunately had the chance to go check out Sweeney Todd on Broadway last weekend, so I was a little otherwise engaged. I would recommend, but as we sit here, I think that Josh Groban and Annalee Ashford only have like 3 shows remaining before they get cycled out. So well worth the trip for me.
If you didn't see enough bloodletting last year, you get to go do it again there. All right.
The worst team in London.
There you go. Appreciate it very much, and look forward to talking to you later on.
Yeah, man. Anytime.
Next week, we have Matt Pauley coming in from KMOX. But until then, for Jeff, I'm Daniel. Good night.
He hits it in the air to left field. Back is Chavez. At the wall. This ball is gone. 2-run home run, Yadier Molina. And St. Louis takes a 3-1 ninth inning Game 7 lead.